President Trump was meant to visit China in late March for a long-awaited summit with Xi Jinping. Economic relations were expected to dominate the agenda, with trade, rare earths, and stabilizing ties between the two powers up for discussion. But then the United States joined Israel in striking Iran at the end of February, and the war that followed caused President Trump to postpone the summit until mid-May. So now, after 40 days of conflict in the Middle East, the context seems to have changed significantly. But does that mean the focus of the summit will shift at all? Has the war changed how China views the United States in a way that actually will adjust its negotiating strategy? Or should we anticipate a similar outcome in May to if the summit had taken place as planned? Today we're going to discuss, has the Iran war upended U.S. China negotiations? Welcome to State of Play. I'm your host, Will Todman, and in this podcast, the CSIS Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department brings together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. Well, joining me today for the first time on State of Play, we have Scott Kennedy, who is Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics. Scott, thanks so much for joining.
Well, it's great to be here.
And Scott, I know that you travel to China a lot and have a lot of discussions. Were you there recently?
Yes, well, I was there in January for a week, 4 times last year. So planning to go again very soon because I really enjoy jet lag and United Airlines frequent flyer miles. I'm not sure either of those, but it's the best way to kind of hear what people feel on the street.
Okay, of course, I will ask you about that, of course. And also Brian Hart, who's Deputy Director and Fellow in the China Power Project. Brian, you've been on before, but a pleasure to have you back. Thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be back.
And your knee injury that we discussed last time is all healed.
Yes,
okay.
Although I'm running again a race this weekend, so we'll see how it looks after that.
Is that wise?
Yeah.
Okay, well, fingers crossed. All right, let's talk about China. So as I mentioned, the summit was originally scheduled for the end of March. And if I've got this correct, this would have been the first summit between President Trump and Xi since 2017, when Trump hosted Xi at Mar-a-Lago, of course, during his first term. Not that they've not met since, but I think that was the last summit between the two. Then I think a lot of the discussion was about North Korea. Of course, trade came up as well. But I wanted to start by asking you both, originally, what had President Trump hoped to get out of this summit in Xi? Were economics going to dominate as much as I said in the intro? Sure.
Just a point of clarification, following the cake summit in Mar-a-Lago, the two sides where we heard Annabelle, the president's granddaughter, sing for Xi Jinping and his wife. They did meet in China afterward.
Okay.
I think later in November of 2017. I know because I saw the planes on the tarmac, and only one person flies in those planes with those paint colors on them. But it's been a while since they've met for sure. And so they've had a lot of phone calls since, but this is an important meeting and potentially the first of several this year. I think the U.S.'s view is that the conversation should primarily be about economics and trade, but narrowly conceived with regard to very specific issues, individual items that we can name. So rare earths, semiconductors, investment in the United States, potentially a board of trade to manage our trade between each other. But that's not a very broad, that's a long list of things, and you could add some other specifics, but it's not broadly conceived. The two sides are not going to be negotiating about the overall structure of the rules-based order, the appropriateness or inappropriateness of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. We've dispensed with the idea of fairness, and it's basically a wrestling match on trade. So it's going to be narrow. I think from the Chinese perspective, they're happy to talk about those issues because they'd like tariff relief and more access to American markets and to buy American tech. But I think that maybe, as Brian will probably go into, they're going to bring up other issues, particularly around security and Taiwan, I assume.
Yeah, Brian, what do you expect the Chinese to want to bring up?
Yeah, I think both sides have been wanting to continue kind of the relative equilibrium. I hear the word stability a lot. I guess you could use that, but the relative stability since Busan last fall, and continue that so that I think the Chinese in particular want to create strategic space for themselves, to create time. One of the common themes that you hear from the Chinese side is that time is on their side. So I think a goal for them is to keep Washington from putting on new restrictions on China, to ease tensions as much as they can in terms of freeing up China's space. As Scott kind of alluded to, I do think Taiwan is going to be atop of Xi Jinping's mind when he goes into this. I don't think it'll be top of Trump's mind, but I do think it'll be top of Xi's mind. I think the Chinese see a potential strategic opportunity here to push the United States on Taiwan. And they've made a point of doing this in some of the past phone calls with Trump. So I do think that they'll be pushing for that. I think their expectations are maybe low on what they'll get, but I think that they see an opportunity to try here. Okay. I also think they don't necessarily trust if President Trump does make a huge, rhetorical shift on Taiwan. I'm not sure that they believe that has any lasting impact, but I think they're going to see what will happen.
Okay. And so then, of course, the war with Iran has broken out. As I just said, we've had 40 days. We're recording this on April the 8th, and we had a ceasefire announced last night. We will see whether it holds. It's already been tested significantly this morning. But I wonder how that war with Iran has affected China, and particularly as it relates to the topics that we've just talked about.
Sure. Well, certainly if we look at it in the context of the U.S. China rivalry, the war is pretty significant. Already, as a result of the U.S.'s imposition of tariffs, which the Chinese then countered effectively and got the U.S. to back down and got a series of tacos over 2025.
Should we explain what tacos mean for anyone who somehow has not been on the internet?
Everybody now knows that means Trump always chickens out, right? It's basically an FT columnist coined this phrase where Trump threatens a lot and then backs down. It's sort of a consistent practice. And the Chinese, of course, sometimes he goes again up higher and re-escalates, but the Chinese have figured out how when they push hard, he eventually backs up. And so the very high 100+% tariffs the U.S. announced early April, a year ago, the Chinese countered. They put on restrictions on rare earths, and the U.S. Eventually backed down, lowered the tariffs, basically has a hiatus on any new export controls against the Chinese. So the president's international trade and economic strategies already run into a Chinese Great Wall. And then then we've got the Iran situation in which the president, again, sort of underestimated how difficult handling Iran would be and getting bogged down. Now, yes, it's only been a few weeks, but it already feels like there is no obvious chance of a strategic victory. The costs are high. Exit is difficult. And the Chinese have been benefiting. And in fact, it appears, based on reporting that we've seen, is that China, working with Pakistan, played a significant role in getting the ceasefire that was announced over the last day. I'd just say on the downside for China potentially is, they get a lot of oil from Iran. But I did a little math. I'm not very good at math, which is why I work in a think tank and not a professor. But, China gets 61% of its energy from coal, 18% from oil, 21% from nuclear and other renewables. About 1.4 million barrels per day is our guess from Iran out of 16.6 million barrels, which means 8.4% of their oil from Iran, but only 1.5% of Chinese total energy comes from Iran, and they've got a lot of stockpiles of and reserves for oil, and of course they're building batteries and clean tech like nobody. And it's Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and others that are feeling the pinch more than China on the problem with the Strait of Hormuz. So they've somehow managed to make this in their favor. That's the biggest winner as a result of the war, but they're certainly are suffering less relative to others.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to make a lot of the same points. So I think net negative for China. I don't think China didn't want this war to happen. It does create costs for them, as Scott alluded to, like the energy costs, supply chain disruptions, and all of that. So China doesn't want this, and I think they are trying to negotiate with Pakistan, which is a very close partner of Beijing's, to try to bring this conflict to an end. But I think, as Scott said, there are a lot of like relative upsides here too for China compared to some of the other countries. I think it really validates China's big investments in green tech. I think it also validates their kind of fail-safe option of having domestic coal to rely on, which is not the case for a lot of other countries. On the security side, I think it is from Beijing's perspective, unfortunate that the Tehran has been weakened by this, and Tehran is an important partner for Beijing in the Middle East. I think some people have overanalyzed the importance of Iran to China, but I think they are an important country for China. But I think at the strategic level, the big silver lining of all of this for Beijing is U.S. distraction and getting bogged down in another conflict in the Middle East, and even concretely, redeploying assets from the Indo-Pacific theater to the Middle East and to the Central Command. That is something that Beijing does want to see from a military planning and kind of strategic level. So I think you see a lot of Chinese scholars writing about how they've been saying for years that the United States has not funded or adequately resourced the pivot or the turn to Asia, and I think for them this confirms a lot of that.
But are they feeling that that's kind of a permanent thing? I mean, it strikes me if President Trump says, okay, now we have peace in the Middle East, maybe these negotiations go well, there is some grand deal with Iran that includes sanctions relief. Could they not redeploy lots of those military assets to the Indo-Pacific areas much closer to China?
They can reshuffle some assets around, but I think one of the biggest things that obviously U.S. adversaries are paying attention to is munitions drawdowns. I mean, just the immense use of munitions, air defenses, missile defenses, defending against drones. So especially Iran's asymmetric use of capabilities to draw down U.S. Air defenses. I think that's a big one. Those things take time, and China pays a lot of attention to weaknesses in the U.S. defense industry, and they know that it's going to take time for the United States to rebuild some of those capabilities.
Yeah, I would just add some of the larger additional shifts that are related to these specific policy areas and the war in the Middle East, which has to do with principles around the use of force, right? So the U.S. has long maintained that countries have a right to sovereignty, and that it's been China's threat in the Taiwan Strait that is what people should worry about, and has framed, in some ways, the use of military force by China against Taiwan, if unprovoked, as entirely illegitimate. The U.S. actions in Venezuela, Iran, some other places the U.S. has bombed, the threats against Canada, Greenland, etc., sort of peel back the core principles that the U.S. has been advocating on its own and with its allies. Obviously, the likelihood of war in the Taiwan Strait is not immediately changed by what's going on, but it does slightly shift how people would view that possibility, how China might justify it, how the U.S. and its allies might respond. I think what we've seen over the last several months and first the year on economics, the U.S. and its allies really disagreeing significantly, trying to find common ground and reach variety of agreements, but really have very different views of how the global economy should run. And now in terms of security, also significant differences. Again, these may be more rhetorical flourishes and short-term things that could be repaired or be put to the side in the event of some crisis in East Asia. But I think they still change how folks are looking at the Taiwan Strait and other ways in which China might use force.
Yeah, I'm pleased you brought that up because I wanted to think about that a bit and the degree to which this does allow China to say, as a global power, it's the stable one, it's the more reliable one, it's not it's not making threats about destroying civilizations.
Yeah, I'll just say and my assumption is that Chinese don't take this idea seriously, but I've heard at least a couple times from Chinese, well, the U.S. went into Venezuela. Well, what if we just kidnapped Lai Ching-te, the president of Taiwan? Well, what would be different about that? And so I don't think it's something that they're seriously considering. But if our actions give them the ability to imagine new things that they might do, which would be extremely destabilizing, that's a bad precedent that we're setting.
And Brian, I think your program wrote some pieces about that actually after the capture of Maduro at the start of the year.
Yeah, people immediately drew parallels to China potentially wanting to do some kind of decapitation strike on Taiwan, similar to U.S. removal of Maduro in Venezuela. I think, as Scott said, I think many people, write off the idea that China is going to kidnap Lai in the same way that we did Maduro. But certainly the PLA is paying attention to what the United States does on these fronts and is drawing lessons. I will say that's actually going to be a big long-term takeaway for China here is in the 90s, U.S. successes in the Gulf War and also U.S. capabilities during the 95, 96 Taiwan Strait crisis really impressed upon China the need for military modernization. And we've seen the fruits of that over the last couple of years, where the PLA today is completely different from back then. And I think U.S. operational successes in the Middle East, in Iran right now, are impressing the Chinese. I think it's confirming a lot of their suspicions that the U.S. is highly capable. I think it strengthens Xi Jinping's hands to really double down on modernization. It's been a military modernization. It's been a high priority for him. I think he can now turn to, Chinese, political, the party and to the PLA and say, look, this is how capable the United States is. This is another reason why China needs to continue investing in these capabilities.
So bringing it back then to the summit that we're talking about in May, and I wonder how much of what's happened with Iran will actually shift the focus of the discussion. Scott, at the start, you said the US really wants this conversation to be about economics and trade, not so broadly conceived, and China is pretty happy to talk about those things. Is that still the same? Or do they now want other things to be part of the agenda?
I think the agenda is going to be roughly what it would have been a month ago, but the mood will change as a result. China will have a little bit more leverage, feel a little bit less pressure from the United States. The U.S. Economic numbers aren't looking as solid as they were. We have a little bit more inflation. We're a little bit closer to the midterm elections. The president can ask and suggest and put deals on the table, but it'll be much harder for him to threaten economic pain or anything else that would really surprise or worry the Chinese immensely. Of course, China thinks they really have the relationship now in a much better place. Trump is amazingly unpredictable, one of his great strengths. And of course, he could change his mind at any time. But broadly conceived, all of the discussion on the economic front is on their side of the court. We're not talking about reducing industrial policy and subsidies and fully rebalancing the domestic Chinese economy and, paring back the Belt and Road or debt diplomacy or coercive economic tools elsewhere, anything like that. We're talking about really, really small potatoes. And in some cases, it's actually potatoes that they might be making.
Oh, the agricultural piece.
Might
okay.
be. So obviously, the Chinese have their own challenges. Their economy has slowed down dramatically. They have purges within the PLA. They also want a peaceful environment to address their challenges. And Xi Jinping needs to prove that he's managing the relationship well. So they don't want this thing to go off the rails. But I think the word that I've heard, I don't know, Brian's probably heard it too, over the last few months is confidence, that the Chinese have confidence about the way they're managing the relationship, even though they face all of these other significant challenges.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the confidence part there. And I think the war in Iran increases that for China, mostly because I think, the Chinese are going to be really attuned to President Trump's own political standing here at home. And, if you look at all the polling, the war in Iran is very unpopular. And I think President Trump's own approval has been taking a hit. And there have been some divides on the war within, the Republican Party and within the MAGA movement. So I don't think that fundamentally changes things, but I do think it gives Xi Jinping a little bit more confidence going into this, and maybe to him signals that President Trump needs this summit quite a lot to strengthen President Trump's standing here at home for it to go well. The one thing I would say is, we're recording this on what's today?
April the 8th.
April 8th.
Yeah.
Thank you. So who knows, in a couple of days, things could go differently, and this summit could be postponed or canceled, yet again.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know. If it does get postponed again or canceled, I do think that starts to have actual material impacts, because then it potentially messes up the cadence of what we assume are going to be meetings coming later this year, including a likely Xi visit to the United States. So if we start to get to that, I think then it really starts to have actual impacts.
So do you think, using your crystal balls, do you expect the outcomes of the summit to be any different in May than if it had been in March? Or are these changes sort of too small, so it's probably going to look quite similar?
The deliverables are probably not that materially different. One thing that I think will be different is I do think Xi will likely raise the Iran war with President Trump, which of course before the war began he wouldn't have done. But I think it's likely to be in a different conversation than the way that China is casting this for public audiences. I think it's largely going to be more focused on maybe some of these parochial interests of China, especially like making sure its own people are not harmed in the conflict. And that's always China's top priority when these kinds of things happen.
I think one of the differences between these two meetings is the 6 weeks that are between them. So the U.S. and China really only started seriously negotiating the visit for late March, in early March. And they had basically one significant meeting, other staff level meetings. But had they met in late March, it probably would have been a relatively thin agreement. This is the 6 weeks in between. If we can multitask, and I don't know if we can, but if we can multitask, then they might actually have been able to get some more words on the page, more ink down. And so the discussion about a board of trade and how they might manage the trade in certain kinds of things, or thinking about foreign investment or some of these other issues, they might have been able to actually get more detail. And then so I think if President Trump does get to Beijing, then I think the chances of the content being a little bit more fleshed out is possible. Again, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yep. Okay, so let's begin to close up then with some rapid fire questions. So firstly, for each of you, can you sum up the impact of the Iran war on U.S. China negotiations in one word or phrase? Brian?
I'd say mixed. I think it's a mixture, for China's perspective at least, a mixture of upsides and downsides.
Okay.
I'd say, slightly disadvantageous to the United States.
Okay. So then of the US, China, and Russia, who's had the best week, who's had the worst week? Scott?
I think China.
Yeah.
By far. Russia gains some perhaps, but really if China's played a role in getting the ceasefire, then they've got some Baijio that they can cheer with.
Yep.
Yeah, I would definitely say China. And more importantly, that the United States has had by far the worst week.
Yeah. Okay. And then finally, is there one word or phrase that you'd like to ban pundits from using when talking about this summit, the impact of the Iran war, or just more broadly?
We should never, ever, at least while the Trump administration is in office, hear someone say the word grand bargain. The chances of there being a grand bargain is nil, because the U.S. is just looking to manage the relationship with another great, large power. We're not trying to divvy up the world, remake the order collaboratively or anything like that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think mine would be stability.
Oh, I said it.
Yeah.
I said it.
Everyone has said it. That's been in every headline. But
Okay.
I think the U.S.-China relationship is inherently unstable. And if you want to get really nerdy with the analogy, maybe you could say we're in a state of what's the equilibrium? There's a chemical term for this, but things are constantly going forward and backward.
Okay.
That looks like equilibrium, but it's not really stable.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so when we talked about what President Trump was originally hoping to get out of the summit, Scott, you said, this was not broadly conceived, not a grand bargain, as you've just said. This was more narrowly about economics and trade with focus on rare earths, semiconductors, investment, things like that. China's basically happy to talk about all of these things. They want to ease tensions. They want some strategic space and time. Brian, I think you said Taiwan will be top of mind. And so they may not, come out in public about this, but they're sort of hoping to see if they can push the United States on Taiwan a bit. Then when we talked about Iran, I think you said, the costs have been high to President Trump. Clearly, there's been a domestic hit. The economic situation in the US is looking worse. There's been the fact that he's been sort of distracted from the Indo-Pacific and has pulled assets out of there. Brian, you said China really pays attention to this, particularly thinking about the munitions drawdowns. And Scott, you said, China's really looking at the changing principles of the US use of force. And so the US actions kind of peel back some of these sort of long-standing principles that the US has had that may create more space for China in the future when it comes to Taiwan. Probably not just yet, though, I think, Brian, you said. So, but then you also said, there are long-term takeaways for China on the US operational successes in Iran. And so that's likely to prompt Xi to double down on his military modernization strategy. So then when we come to this upcoming summit in May, or scheduled for May, I should say, Scott, you said the mood will change, but not necessarily the agenda. So China is feeling less pressure. Again, things for the US are looking worse. So you both said that China has a sense of confidence. But if it gets postponed again, that will start to have more of an impact. But Scott, you actually said there could be some benefits to this in that there has been longer for the US and for US and Chinese officials to negotiate and to work through some of the details of the deliverables that may come out of it. So we may actually see more substance as a result. But ultimately, this thing could get derailed again, and that it is expected to be more narrow, and it's not going to result in, again, the grand bargain that you talked about. So I think then, has the Iran war upended US-China negotiations? My sense from both of you is no, not upended. There are some important shifts sort of below the surface, but we're not seeing a fundamentally different picture. So I look forward to having you both back when the summit actually happens. If it happens, we'll see how it truly did play out. A lot can change in the next, how many weeks is it? 6 weeks, 5 weeks, something like that. I certainly know that from the Middle East, the part of the world I focus on. So who knows? But this has been really interesting. Thank you both so much, Scott and Brian.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker. Until next time.